Hello, this is Peter Takács, professor of piano at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. It is Monday, April 6th here in Oberlin, beautiful sunny day. And I'm hoping that everyone is safe and healthy in this very strange time that we have. I'm going to deliver a talk on the Beethoven piano sonatas, which I was supposed to give at the Chicago National Conference. I'm very sorry to miss my friends and my colleagues that I was looking forward to meeting in Chicago. But it is the 250th anniversary of the master composer. And so I think it's important to remember how important it is to talk about it and to celebrate the greatness of this music that has endured for 250 years and probably will endure for another 250. Behind me is a very favorite portrait of mine of Beethoven by Waldmüller. It was painted in 1825, so it's a picture of the aging master 2 years before his death in 1827. If you go to my website, which is petertakachpianist.com, and you click on ideas, the last topic under ideas will be something called dilemmas, conundrums, and other quandaries in the Beethoven piano sonatas. And if you click on that, you'll get an outline that I'm going to be following today. The original title for this lecture for Chicago was Beethoven piano sonatas FAQs, frequently asked questions. So the dilemmas part will be a nice subtitle for this talk. I want to talk a little bit about what our task is, which is to try to get as close as possible to the composer's meaning and intention in these great pieces. And for that, we need an excellent edition, which luckily is nowadays readily available, sometimes for a bit of money. The one that I used when I recorded these sonatas, you can see that it's well worn, is the Henley edition, which is still excellent, and it can still be used a lot. Recently there's a couple of new ones which I also admire a great deal. There is the British edition, the Associated Board, edited by Barry Cooper, a great musicologist. And I do appreciate the fact that the commentary, which is quite elaborate and helpful, can be separated and can be kept next to the score. So if there's any kind of question, we can refer to the detailed notes. So that's a great advantage. Lately, I've been quite fond of the Bärenreiter edition, which is quite new, and it has a beautiful chocolate-covered front, outside covers, and I admire it greatly. I think the editor is Jonathan Delmar, a wonderful editor. It has important notes about not only details of the score, but also some guidelines for stylistic interpretation. The one thing I do appreciate about this edition is no fingerings. And for me, that's an advantage. Some people like printed fingerings. I find them that they get in the way, and I prefer to find my own. So this one, no fingerings other than Beethoven's own, which we'll talk about later. There's one more reference work that I want to recommend. That is the Czerny book on the interpretation of all the Beethoven piano sonatas. And this one is kind of a reference. It was written about 15 years after Beethoven's death. But Czerny was a very honest commentator with the privilege of having studied many of these sonatas with Beethoven himself. Every piece with piano, or almost every piece with piano, is in this book, and every movement every selection has a metronome marking, which is very helpful and very interesting, although I don't always agree with them. And we'll talk about the metronome also a little bit later. If you look at the outline that's on my website, I have divided into some categories. So the first category there I call dilemmas. And to me, it's really important to realize that even with an excellent Urtext score, there will be questions. There will be choices that editors have to make between different sources, whether it's the manuscript or the first edition or some sketches or some letters that were preserved between Beethoven and the publisher. So there's no such thing as a totally definitive score. And so as interpreters, we have the duty to investigate and to look at different options and sometimes to make decisions that are maybe different from what's printed. That is a very important responsibility, and we shouldn't take it lightly. We can't just say, oh, I don't like this being piano, so I'm going to play it forte or something like that. You have to have a very good reason before you attempt to break some of the rules. So what are some of these dilemmas? The first one I mention is the missing dot, and it just happens to be the first note of the first published sonata, Opus 2 number 1 in F minor. So from the very first note we have problems. The issue there is that the first note, which is an upbeat to a kind of a rising arpeggio beginning, sometimes we call it the rocket theme, does not have a staccato dot on it, and all the other notes do have staccatos. And then when the theme returns in the left hand, there's a staccato on the upbeat. Later on, the right hand also has no staccato, and then the left hand does have staccato. So it's consistent. So some people have asked the question, and this is not a new problem, it's been talked about quite a lot, because it's so obvious. What should we do with that first note? Did Beethoven intend for it, for example, to be a little longer than the following note? So it would be like... Or some people actually think, and some highly respected interpreters think, that maybe it's supposed to be a slur to the downbeat. So it's... when it comes to the left, so it's a big question. My own opinion, and I must say my friend and mentor Malcolm Bilson agrees with me, is that it's just a short upbeat. It's a light upbeat, and to make it either longer or slurred is not what Beethoven intended. So basically it should be... Later on, the E flat upbeat, no dot on it. But that is a choice we have to make because it's not actually in the score, and it happens twice, so we have to wonder if it's some kind of an intentional message that we're getting from Beethoven. Basically, it's a short upbeat. I think Beethoven really knew how to write, for example, a slur. He does it here. He writes a slur there, so if he wanted a slur, I think he would have written one. So let's assume that what he thought was that everybody would know that this is part of a rising arpeggio and it should be a short note. But it's not in the score, so it's a dilemma. Here's another one. This is from Sonata Opus 90. I've talked about this before too. I call it the smudge, because sometimes in the autograph scores there are things that are not very clear. Sometimes there's like a coffee stain or something in the actual handwriting. That one is a lovely second movement. And then there's a place that goes... sharp that I think should be there is smudgy. Some people think it should be an A. The smudge is like between A and G sharp. So in some editions, very respected ones, it's an A, which I find sort of boring and also not consistent. T, and then T, next time when it comes in octaves, it's a G sharp. Okay, so we don't know, but we're home free because this is a rondo. So all we have to do is check the next statement of that theme and compare and see maybe the smudge was there the first time, but second time it'll obviously be clear. So we turn the pages, and what happens is that instead of writing out the return of the rondo theme, Beethoven writes come sopra, which means as above, basically meaning do it like the first time. So we keep turning the pages, go to the third statement of the theme, come sopra. So he never actually rewrites that particular passage. So we have no internal evidence for it. However, the fourth time this comes back, it comes, the theme comes in the left hand. Now let me see if I can find it. I'd like to find it in my well-worn Henley edition. Let's see. Yeah, it comes in the left hand, so it's very, and everything is in parallel thirds or tenths or sixths. And then when we get to our favorite spot, there we have it. You remember? It comes in thirds in the bass, and the downbeat is just 100% clear. It's a G sharp. So I must say that Mr. Cooper and Mr. Del Mar both printed G sharp there. However, the Henley and other excellent editions have an A. So you have to do a little detective search for things. I will skip over the next one, but I have a nice suggestion here. If you look down on number 4 there under dilemmas, parallel section discrepancies. It's a very interesting one. What we're just talking about here is comparing different sections of a piece to see if there are some kind of differences, some intentional variations by the composer when things return, or when you compare exposition to a recap, for example. Okay, so I will show you one that to me is interesting. It's from Sonata Opus 101, first movement. It's right after Opus 90, so we can go there. Beautiful first movement, Allegretto Espressivo. There's a wonderful little section in the exposition. This is a short sonata form. Right here. Crescendo, piano. Crescendo, piano. So we have crescendo, piano, and then we have a nice long crescendo piano. Okay, lovely. He's kind of trying to go upwards, and he returns, and upwards again, returns. The third time it soars before going to a kind of a second theme. All right, so we look at the recapitulation, which is a few different things. In that same passage, the first two statements, no crescendo and no piano. So it's basically quiet. Then the third one has the big crescendo. It goes all the way up to sforzando and then back. Okay, so it's something different between the sections. I think it's definitely interesting. Then you have to kind of wonder, did he really want that return to be softer, more tranquillo, and then of course have the crescendo for the third little group? And it's possible that he wanted the return to be more tranquillo and different from the first time, so I'll play it for you. It's credible. For my taste, I find it a little disappointing, just because I want those first attempts before the big one, and I miss it. So when I play this piece, I actually put in a crescendo piano twice, and then I do a big crescendo at the end. So let's see how that sounds. I like it. I believe in it. It's not in the score. So I'm putting something in there that wasn't written by Beethoven. We have the manuscript. There are no crescendos there. So there you have to make a decision of what we call by analogy. First time he has one thing, second time he has different. You have to decide if the difference is intentional or maybe he just expected that it would be done like the first time. You can never go wrong by doing what's printed, but sometimes we have to make decisions based on what I call internal evidence. Okay? All right. What else? What other kind of dilemmas do we have? There's the big one about registers. The pianos that Beethoven had up to about 1800, maybe a few years later, were the size of Mozart pianos. They were usually Walter. Forte pianos, they were basically 5-octave instruments. So I would say maybe it goes from F to F. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So anything above F and below the low F was not available. And so in the early sonatas, he has to do some kind of adjustment at the top and at the bottom in order to make it playable, because he wanted to sell scores, right? And people would send the score back and say, look, I can't play this, my piano doesn't have those notes. So sometimes the question arises, should we add those extra notes if we have them available, which we do on the modern piano? And that is a tricky question. So I'll give you two examples, one where I think it's quite okay, and one where I don't think it's okay to play extra notes. This is, first one is from Opus 14, number 2. It's a lovely sonata. Lovely, very mellow, kind of almost a sonatina. It's a smaller sonata. There's one passage there in the exposition that goes like this. It's in G major. There's our F. He doesn't have anything above F, so when he wants to go to an F sharp, he has to diddle around lower. So I think what he wanted was I think he wanted an F sharp. Do I know that for sure? I don't. Am I allowed to play the F sharp even though it's not printed? Maybe the Urtext police will arrest me, but I play an F sharp there. Sorry. Now, obviously, we can compare it to the recap, which comes lower. He goes to the upper note. To me, it's totally obvious that that's what he wants. So in this instance, it's just one little note above his upper edge. I play the F sharp. Now again, you cannot be blamed if you play what's printed. I find it a little bit dull. But it's a personal decision. you take responsibility, say you have good reasons for it, so I do it. Here's one where he still bumps against the upper edge of the early piano, but I would not change it because what he comes up with to make up for it is so exciting and so special that there's no point in trying to play the extra notes that we have. I'll show you what it is. It's in a Tempest Sonata. It's lovely. In the exposition, he goes all the way up to F. Great. It's in octaves. It's wonderful. When it comes back in the recapitulation, it's higher. It's in D minor. First one was in A minor. Now when he wants to go up, he would have to go way above the F that he has. He goes all the way to B flat. So he doesn't have those notes, so he has to make an adjustment. But it's just kind of fantastic because what he does is repeats the upper D. And I find that really exciting. It's bumping against the wall, but making it kind of feel like a struggle. So that's one place where I would never extend the range there, even though I have the notes. But his solution is bracingly powerful, so I wouldn't change it. Okay, upper register, lower register, sometimes you run into octaves that go down. When it gets to E, he has to leave out the bottom. I think it's okay to continue the octaves. Various sonatas, including Bastine and so on. Again, you can decide to do what's printed, but I think he clearly wanted the low octaves to continue. There's a famous spot in Opus 101. It's the first piano he had that went all the way down to a C. So he was very excited about it, and the sonata is in A major, so he's got lots of low E's in it on the dominant chord. And you can see in my examples there where he struggles with how to write a low E. He's got ledger lines and all that kind of thing, but he really pounds that low E. So the thing about Beethoven is whenever he had more notes, he immediately used them. So he was happy when the pianos became larger. Eventually 6.5 octaves and that kind of thing. But it's definitely a quandary or perhaps a conundrum, what to do with the register limitations. Okay, we're going to go on to, I want to mention another problem is what we call the 4/3 fingering. I won't spend too much time on it, but in Opus 101, it's example 5. He's got these tied A's with the fingering 4/3 written on the first one, which means that he wants 4/3 for all of them. What does it mean? It's a tied note. Why don't we just play? We don't really know. Czerny gives us an idea that the second note should be like an echo of the first one. So you play the fourth finger, and then the third catches like a weaker second note. It's not very reliable. Maybe on the old piano it was easier. There's an article by Mr. Badura Skoda, whom I respect greatly. He just passed away recently, where he talks about this issue of the 4/3 fingering. And his opinion is that it should be a tied note. And the 4/3 is meant to mean that Beethoven didn't want to just play a single note, but he wanted to feel the syncopation. And so he wrote a 4/3 so that what a string player can do more easily than us to go, they can actually sense the tied note in their bow or in the wind. And so he wanted to avoid that sense of like kind of a woodpecker type sound. We don't really know. There's the most famous use of that 4/3 is in the cello sonata in A major. The second movement has 4/3, 4/3 at the beginning, meaning that that's what he wants for the whole piece. I've tried it that way, and the piece is long and it's quite repetitive, and it gets so tiresome. Plus controlling this echo thing. So I don't play the 4/3, the Czerny suggestion. I just play the fingering, just a few then the cello comes in, tied notes, and they can feel the syncopation in their bow, and we feel it in our third finger. There's an argument about that. Nobody knows the correct answer, but that's my solution to it. I'm with Paul Badura's Skoda, so I'm in pretty good company. I want to talk about tempo issues because it's so important. In fact, for Beethoven, it was kind of a paramount concern. Supposedly his first question to his guests was, how were the tempi? When somebody came back from a concert of symphonies or whatever. So it's a big one. I think the first thing we need to do, as you see there, is understand the meaning of all the tempo markings. Let's say from grave to prestissimo. And not only to understand what we believe, but to understand what Beethoven meant by them. And then, of course, there's the issue of the metronome. About 1815, he met Johann Melzo, who was an inventor, quite a genius actually. And he had invented the metronome, which had different settings at certain intervals, and it had the moving arm and so on. So Beethoven was very excited about this, and he started writing metronome markings in a lot of his pieces, including all the symphonies, all movements. In the piano sonatas, there's only one that has metronome. It's the Hammerklavier. But later he became a little bit suspicious of this machine. He felt that it was too inflexible, too mechanical. And there's a nice little quote, which you can see there in my notes. When he was asked, you have a metronome quarter note equal 100. Is that what you want for the entire piece? This was a little song. And his answer was, which he wrote down actually, 100 according to Melzo, but this can apply only to the first measures, because feeling also has its tempo. That is just a wonderful quote, which is dear to my heart because it allows me to adjust the tempo according to the feeling of a certain section. So let's look at Hammerklavier for a little bit. His tempo for the first movement is half note equal to 138, which is quite fast. The marking is allegro. And we can imagine the deaf composer kind of feeling this exciting, explosive beginning of the Hammerklavier, the big monument of a piece. And he says, oh yeah, let's see the metronome. So we're going to try the beginning of the Hammerklavier at 138. Okay. To my mind, that is an absurdly fast tempo. And it's been discussed many times. There are many people that play it at that speed, and I admire them. It's a virtuoso feat. But to me, the piece sounds hyper, nervous. And again, we have to think about character. The character of the piece is triumphant and annunciatory and so on. So, and then the Beethoven quote, when the feeling changes, we have to change the tempo. Like, there's no way to, it has no meaning at that speed. And then the main theme, absolutely joyously victorious. Okay, that's the spirit of this movement. So you can see in my example that I adjusted the tempos. The opening, I have it at 126. The next cantabile interlude, I have it at 104, I believe, right? And then the main tempo is 116, so that's quite a departure from 138. Tempo varies, but I think it just delivers this victorious atmosphere of the first movement. All the movements to me seem to be on the fast side, including the fugue, and Mr. Badura Skoda again has an essay on this topic, and he believes that the tempo is maybe 25% fast. Could be a defective metronome, or it could be the deaf composer not really hearing the click of the metronome. We don't know for sure. And I respect anybody who follows the original metronomes. I personally, from a musical point of view, it's not technical. I don't believe in it. Let me talk about a little issue I have. If I can find it, I will do it. Let me see. This is Opus 26 Sonata. It's a lovely theme and variations movement. It's marked Andante con variazioni, Opus 26. So with variations, there are always small adjustments between the theme and the variations because some are more lively, etc. So here's something that I think about, and that is, what kind of piece are we playing? And I believe that this theme is a minuet. So if you think of minuets, here's a certain flow, a certain grazioso quality, right? So that's kind of the tempo. I also have Andante favori. It's a minuet, right? So that's basically my tempo for the theme. Very lovely flowing. Now I've heard recordings that are a lot slower than that. But I really believe that Andante in the 18th century was not a terribly slow tempo. Plus the genre is minuet, right? First variation pretty much stays same tempo, maybe moves a bit. It's fine. It all feels pretty good. Something I call tempo giusto, which means that it feels natural. It sits well. Right? Next variation is kind of alternate hands. It might move a little bit, but it's still in the same ballpark, right? Okay. The issue comes with the following variation, which is in A flat minor, very dark key. To me, it has a feeling of a dirge of some kind, very lamenting and heavy, with 7 flats and so on. So I played slower. It's not marked any slower. Syncopations, that kind of suspensions that hang over into the next bar, which are very expressive. And I find that at the tempo of the theme, it sounds a little too kind of normal. So let's call this one maybe a kind of a dirge or an elegy. The tempo of the theme was quarter note 96. Is it quarter note 96? It's 8. 96. When I get to the dirge, I get 8 note equal 88, so quite a bit slower. Let's see how that feels. 88. Okay, going from the dirge to the next variation, let's say we go back to around 96 or 90 something tempo di tema. Let's see what we get. 8 note 96, let's say. That doesn't work for me. I find this movement after the lament of the dirge to be more of like a little bit of a scherzo. So I speed up quite a bit. In fact, I do almost like double tempo. Let's say the 16th note of the dirge becomes the 8th note of the scherzo. So that's a doubling of the tempo. The dirge was slower, the scherzo is twice as fast. I mean, 16th note equal 8th note. It's almost like a tempo modulation. So basically, I can't believe in this. It doesn't respond to any kind of character, what Mr. Fleischer calls, my revere teacher, the wisdom of the material. What is it telling you? What this one's telling me is that it's almost jocoso, kind of playful. And then when we go to the finale, which is very, very beautiful, it returns to pretty much tempo di tema, maybe a bit slower. So, tempo is of paramount importance, and we have to do a lot of thinking, a lot of feeling of character, and maybe experimenting with different tempos until something feels like it really locks in. What jazz players call finding the groove, right? When you find the groove, then everything seems to fall into place, and it's quite exhilarating to find it. It might be possible that the next morning you have a different tempo because you had more coffee, but it needs to feel as if the pulse is alive and it responds to the character of the music. Big question. I'm going to skip over a few things here. I want to talk a little bit about the pedals. You know, on the early pianos, the pedal was in the knee, later become a foot pedal. And so in early pieces, Beethoven, when he wanted the pedal, he said senza sordini, which means without dampers, meaning the dampers were raised. Later, he just wrote pedal, and he was quite specific about it. Let's take a famous pedal spot, which is in the Tempest Sonata, the recitative. I'm keeping the pedal all the way down, but I don't think it's the right way to do it. That's a little bit too muddy. I don't think that was the intended effect, because we still have a dominant chord. We want really a sense of resolution. So what happens is that on the old piano, the sound would disappear quite a bit faster than on our modern pianos, which are resonant, big instruments. So the effect was one of a kind of a echo effect of just fumes of the previous harmony lingering, but really fading out. So on our piano, we need to flutter the pedal and use our ears make sure that it has that special effect. I'm going to try it. It was pretty good. It depends on the piano too. So we have to be careful with the Beethoven pedal markings. Often on the modern piano, if we keep it as written, like let's say in the Moonlight Sonata, the effect is quite jarring and muddy. So I would definitely think about fluttering the pedal occasionally, maybe even changing. But some overlap is fine because I think that was the intended effect, almost like being in a cavern or a cave or something like that. And Czerny mentions that effect. The una corda, a very special pedal for the early instruments. It was very sensitive. You know, it could move kind of gradually from tre corde, meaning 3 strings, to maybe due corde, 2 strings, and then una corda, 1 string, and then back again. So there was an effect of gradual muffling, distancing of the sound, and then also gradual return. It's very beautiful, and I think Beethoven used it for special effect of a kind of remote, eerie sound, like let's say Opus 101, third movement, with una corda. It's very beautiful, special, isolated, far away. Then at the end of that movement, which is kind of an introduction to the 4th movement, if you want to call that, he says, it's in the examples, example 8 says, poi a poi tutte le corde, meaning gradually return to all the strings. And it's a beautiful feeling of somehow opening up the sound. The sun coming up, perhaps, as he gets to the return of the theme from the first movement. So it's una corda. Poi a poi tutte le corde. There's a sunrise feeling, which is quite wonderful after this hushed introduction. So special effect, we need to experiment with it on our pianos because they're not quite as sensitive as far as the shift to 2 strings or 1 string. But to capture the special atmosphere that Beethoven's trying to create. As always, he was an experimenter. He always liked to use whatever it was available for his finding the expressive quality of what he was trying to say. So in that sense, I think studying historical instruments, the old forte pianos, playing them, listening to recordings is very, very useful. There's one by Malcolm Bilson and his students on the Claves, Claves label, all 32 sonatas on various instruments, starting with Mozart and ending up with quite a large instrument, a broadwood and perhaps a Graf. It's worth listening to because it captures some of these qualities that we need to be able to reproduce on our modern instrument, right? Okay. Just to close, the most important thing is capturing what I call the affect. It's number 8 in my outline there. It's clear to me that Beethoven's music, and maybe music in general, expresses human emotions. Some people don't like that idea because it's music is supposed to be a pure art that doesn't actually have emotional connotation or any kind of association with other media like literature and so on, or poetry. To me, music is about expressing emotion. And you can read Beethoven's markings, he has all sorts of expressive marks, dolce, cantabile, appassionato, con amabilità, sehnsuchtsvoll, maestoso. Those are all expressions of human emotions and emotional states. So we need to find that. One emotion that I think he captures powerfully and is very important to him is what I call the Fidelio effect, which is capturing the darkness of a prison or a dungeon, and then gradually the prisoner comes to life and expresses pain, suffering, and also hope. One example would be maybe Opus 10 number 3, the slow movement. Very dark. It's marked largo e mesto, which means sad, with suffering. And then when the melodic line opens up, he writes rinforzando, which means stronger. So, rinforzando. He does the same in the Waldstein Sonata, Introduzione. When the vocal line comes in, he says rinforzando. Very special. One other emotion that I think he captures well, very dramatic, is what I call the stern pleading duet, where let's say the lower voice is powerful and implacable, and the upper voice is more human and maybe kind of helpless. Let's see, maybe in the Tempest Sonata he has that. Let's say the left hand is the power of the storm, let's say, and the right hand or the upper line is the pleading sailor who's pleading for his life. Something like etc. The strong bottom voice and the other. Great example for that one, but the best example is Fourth Concerto, second movement, which is the gods versus supposedly Orpheus, where that's the implacable gods. Extraordinarily powerful music, and you can imagine it being a psychological state of being of the cruel, let's say, father and the helpless child. It may have special meaning for Beethoven. So those are emotional states expressing the whole range of human feeling, from joy and hope and aspiration and triumph to suffering and despair, lament, maybe illness as well, illness and recovery, like he does in Opus 110 and so on. So that is our final task, is to capture the human meaning of these incredible pieces. So I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I can be contacted at Takács, one word, at oberlin.edu if you have any reactions, and thank you for listening.